Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to offer you a warm welcome to the physics department here on this chilly November evening, but hopefully we're going to have, you're all here not just for the chilly weather, but because of the spy story. So when I was a graduate student, I went down to the library to look up a paper which I needed for my research. It was by somebody called J Fuchs, and I studied it carefully because I had no idea who J Fuchs was. This paper was from 1938. It had been communicated by Neville Mott, who I knew was the head of the Cavendish at one point and was still around when I was over in Cambridge. And inside the paper, actually, it said that Klaus Fuchs's idea for this he got from somebody called R. Peierls, who'd given him the idea about this. And I was interested because even though I was doing my PhD more than 50 years after this paper had been published, it was still relevant because at that time people were trying to develop magnetic thin films for use inside hard disks. In fact, that technology ended up being used in all of our hard disks. And Klaus Fuchs's seminal paper from 1938 was still useful. So I quoted it in my thesis and wrote about it. I had no idea who J Fuchs was. It was only a few years later I discovered there was this other story about J Fuchs. And that, of course, is what we're here for today. It's my great pleasure to have Frank Close here and to welcome him to give this talk. Frank, for those of you who don't know him, let me just say he's Emeritus Professor of Physics, Fellow of Exeter College, a very distinguished particle physicist in his own right. His career has taken him from SLAC, Stanford, Daresbury, CERN, Rutherford Appleton Laboratory, where he was head of the theoretical physics division for a long time, and then to Oxford. He has been decorated with many honours, the OBE, the FRS, the IOP Kelvin Medal, the Royal Society Michael Faraday Prize. I think I first knew Frank's name because physicists of my generation all swatted up on particle physics from his wonderful book, The Cosmic Onion, which I'm sure many people here nodding have benefited enormously from, and there's the new Cosmic Onion. In fact, if you want to learn about particle physics, antimatter, asymmetry in the universe, neutrinos, cold fusion, quantum field theory, the Higgs boson, nothing, and charge, all of those he's written books on. His latest book on charge is out and is a great read. But not only are they books, has he written books on physics, but he's written lots of books on the history of physics, and his books on Bruno Pontecorvo, the Higgs discovery, and of course Klaus Fuchs are absolutely fantastic. He has some books that he can sell you afterwards. So if you want to see him afterwards and buy a book from him, that's a possibility. Sellers. And his book, Trinity, the Treachery and Pursuit of the Most Dangerous Spy in History, is the title of today's talk. And he's written a wonderful book on Klaus Fuchs. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Frank to tell us about the life of Klaus Fuchs. Thank you.
Well, as you did such wonderful publicity for my book writing, I'll let you off the remark, physicists of my generation. Yes, Trinity, how many people here saw Oppenheimer? Okay, so you know then, if the sum total of knowledge was Oppenheimer, you know that Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb and that the only thing the Brits provided was Klaus Fuchs the spy. Both of which are wrong. Oppenheimer, I describe as the midwife of the atomic bomb. The father was Rudolf Peierls, who was professor here when I was doing my DPhil. Trinity has got two connotations. One, of course, it was the code name for the original atomic bomb tests, which took place 80 years ago next July. It also has a connotation of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Well, that was the other reason for the title of the book, which was actually primarily about Peierls, so everybody has seen it as a book about Fuchs. Peierls was the father of the bomb. As we will see, Klaus Fuchs, his assistant, lived with the family at Birmingham and later and became almost like an adopted son. There isn't a Holy Ghost in this, but there's the spooks of MI5 and the FBI. One of the key things that comes out is how was it that the authorities discovered, first of all, that there was a spy at Los Alamos, and secondly, were able to determine that it was Fuchs and not Peierls. And thirdly, why was Fuchs such a failure? I mean, you've heard of him. How many of you have heard of Teddy Hall? Not the place in town, but the person. Teddy Hall was an American spy physicist at Los Alamos who was so successful, hardly anybody's heard of him. Successful spies you don't hear about. If anybody knows about the Oxford spies, let me know. I think they deserve to match the Cambridge counterparts. Okay, let's just describe the main characters to get the story started. So the original idea, insight that led to the possibility of the atomic bomb was by Rudolf Peierls in 1940, at which time he was at Birmingham University. Very quickly it became clear that to develop all of this was going to be a huge enterprise, and it quickly became a national enterprise, not least experimental work that was done here at Oxford involving Nick Curti and Francis Simons, who were developing the mechanisms to test how in practice you could enrich uranium, forcing it through membranes. So a lot of the experimental early work was done here. But Peierls and his assistant Fuchs, who joined in 1941, were theorists, and they were very much leading the effort on the theory of how in practice would you develop a device for enriching uranium-235. Fuchs worked with Peierls in Birmingham for 2 years, 41 to 43. By 1943 end, it was clear that this project was getting to be large, and in practice to proceed would have to be done far away from the possibility of Germany bombing it. And it moved across to North America. Initially for a year in New York, then they moved across to Los Alamos, where the bomb itself was constructed between 44 and 46 and successfully tested at the Trinity test in 1945. Then, after the war, Fuchs and Peierls returned to the UK, Peierls to Birmingham. He didn't arrive at Oxford here until 63 or so. And Fuchs to Harwell, the new laboratory just down the road. And for the next 4 years, he was head of the theoretical physics division at Harwell. And for the whole of those 9 years, he was passing information to the Soviet Union. He didn't make a single mistake, actually, to be fair to him, through the whole of that 9 years. His exposure came about because the Russians made one mistake, and I will reveal to you what that was later on. So let's actually meet the characters and get into the tale. So Rudy and Jenny Peierls, his wife. Rudy was born in 1907 in Berlin. They were both Jewish, he German and she Russian, which of course led to them fleeing Hitler in the mid-30s and came over here to our advantage. Klaus Fuchs was 4 years younger, born in 1911 near Frankfurt. It doesn't sound very much, but at that time, if you sort of add 20 years onto that, you realize this was the birth of quantum mechanics when Peierls and he were beginning their careers. And Peierls, with that 4 years advantage, was already a leading player in developing quantum mechanics. Fuchs was just that 4 years younger, a very promising new student. Which Stephen has alluded to, and I'll come to that in a moment. Fuchs, he was a Lutheran, a social democrat, the family very much anti-Nazi. His family background is very odd. His mother committed suicide by drinking HCl. His grandmother also, and one of his sisters, committed suicide. He had another sister who we will see got peripherally involved in his espionage, and I think he was to defend her because she also had a mental breakdown around 1950, is perhaps the reason why eventually he confessed to it all, but let me not get ahead of myself. So life in Germany, in 1933 the Nazis took over. The communists were the only people prepared to put up candidates to stand against the Nazis. And Fuchs, who was a student activist, became a communist because of that fact. that they were the only people prepared to stand up and be counted. He was, later in life, regarded as quite a quiet person. I think Peierls used to describe him as penny in the slot. So he wouldn't say anything unless you sort of got him started, and then away he would go. But he must have been very eloquent as a student in Germany because he was a student leader and was quickly onto the Gestapo hit list. And he was tipped off that the Gestapo were after him, and that is the reason why he fled initially to France and then over here to Bristol. And so we picked the story up in Bristol, and I found through the Bristol archives this photograph of in 1934, a conference took place at Bristol, and this is probably the first time that Fuchs and Peierls were in the same event, if you like, but I don't think that he met at that stage. Peierls was one of the major frontline speakers. Fuchs, at that stage, was just a graduate student of 3 weeks standing. You see him at the very back there, and Peierls among the speakers at the front. The guy sitting, as you look at it, at the bottom right, in the cross-legged, is Edward Teller, among other luminaries, if that's the right word. The following year, the departmental photograph, you can see Fuchs now in 1935 at Bristol. And this brings us to the following year, which Steve has alluded to, and I'll just amplify on this slightly. So what appears to have happened was that there was some experiments taking place in the physics department on electrical currents through very thin films. And the results didn't fit with the theory that actually J. Thomson had developed. And Fuchs started looking into this. And he actually made great progress with it and pretty well solved it. Peierls was visiting Neville Mott, and Mott told Peierls about Fuchs doing this work, and Fuchs and Peierls talked together. And Peierls was very impressed with Fuchs, who Peierls also was looking at this, and Fuchs, within a few weeks, came up with what Peierls described as a much more elegant solution than the one that he had done. Mott was very keen that the three of them should write up the paper together, and Peierls generously said, no, all I did was talk to him, and he did it much better than me, and that's how Fuchs wrote this paper up himself. And I think, as Stephen said, it's a very highly cited paper. That is perhaps the only open physics paper that Fuchs wrote that is actually taking worth any note of. I don't mean that in a disparaging way. I'm trying to set Fuchs's work into sort of context here. Now, for our story, I suppose that really begins a couple of years later in 1938 with the discovery of fission and the chain reaction. Two little passing comments here. I've got a bee in my bonnet that I don't believe that Hahn and Strassmann should be credited with the discovery of fission. I think that they did no more than Irene Curie and her assistant Savage had done in Paris a year before, namely discover that there were these anomalously light elements being produced when they radiated uranium. It was Frisch and Meitner who interpreted what had happened, and I think they should really be given the historical credit, but that's just to throw a bit of controversy in. One of the things, again, about the Oppenheimer movie, you get the impression that the moment fission was discovered, there was Oppenheimer, brilliant man, saying on my blackboard, oh, we can make a bomb out of this. Well, he may have done, but he was very naive, because it seems that almost only Niels Bohr asked the obvious question, if you can split uranium so easily, and it will liberate energy potentially explosively, why is it all these rocks with uranium in them are not spontaneously exploding around us all the time? And it was Bohr who then pointed out that there are two primary isotopes of uranium, and that the one that is doing the job, if you like, is uranium-235, which is only about 7 atoms in every 1,000. And so the rest of the uranium is blanketing it. And that was published in the open literature, and as of 1938, and even after the war started, fission was well known, the idea that it could liberate energy was well known, and the vision, I think, was no larger than if you had tons of uranium, you could create a heat engine, what we now call a nuclear reactor. The idea that you could make an explosion from it in practice was really not there. The idea that, of course, uranium-235 would be what we now call the key fissile material was quickly realized, and things did then start becoming classified. But it seems that nobody really asked the question, how much of this stuff do you actually need to make a bomb? Otto Frisch, another Jewish emigre, had come across to Birmingham to visit Peierls, and given the situation in Europe, decided to stay. And he started doing some experiments to try to see if he could separate uranium-235 from 238 by thermal diffusion, the relatively lighter U-235 rising to the top, if you like, and could be siphoned off. But he found it very, very difficult. In fact, he was hardly having any success at all, and also he had no idea how long he had to keep going to get anything useful. And so that's what led him to ask Peierls, how much do we need to make? And that was when Peierls realized nobody had really asked that question. And so he did the calculation, and he said, to their shock and horror, discovered that if somehow you could make about a grapefruit size of uranium-235, you would be able to make what we now call an atomic explosion. And he and Frisch, the moment they realized this, Peierls' memoir is very explicit on this, and you can probably imagine it yourself. We've all been physicists here. You do research, you hit your head against the wall all the time, and eventually you see the way through the problem, and then it is instantly obvious, and you think, other people will already have seen this. And that's exactly what Frisch and Peierls feared at that moment, that they realized that if you could have just a few kilograms of uranium-235, it would give an explosive force which they said would be equivalent to that from about 1,000 tons of dynamite. It would emit radiation, which itself would be hazardous and stop people going into the infected area for quite a while. And there would be no material that would be able to resist its force. The only defense against this would be to have such a thing yourself. And that was written up in what became known as the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum, which was classified totally top secret. But it was that started off the whole, what was initially called the Tube Alloys project, and with great British bureaucracy. Because Frisch and Peierls were both Germanic origin and hence technically enemy aliens, they were not allowed to take part in the project that they themselves had started until it was pointed out what a nonsense this was, and Frisch and Peierls were indeed taken on board. And this vast program began of working out how to enrich uranium, and it was quickly decided the best way would be to use diffusion, and as I said, the experiments to see how you could in practice cause uranium to diffuse through very thin holes in membranes were investigated here at Oxford. Frisch and Peierls in Birmingham, and an effort in Cambridge and also at Liverpool where neutron cross-sections were being measured. The whole thing quickly expanded. And Peierls almost immediately became effectively the leader of the whole national effort into this, in addition to his university responsibilities. And that is why by 1941, April 1941, things were sort of exponentially advancing, and he needed an assistant. And that is how Klaus Fuchs came into the game. That chance fact that Peierls had met Fuchs at Bristol back in '38 and been very impressed with this paper that Fuchs had written, plus the fact that Fuchs himself disliked Hitler and had a Germanic background, similar age, and he learnt that Fuchs, who had been interned as an enemy alien and sent off to Canada and had just come back because the Royal Society had taken an initiative to rescue some of the people that had been sent out there. Fuchs was now in Edinburgh. And so Peierls made contact with Bourne in Edinburgh, and Fuchs then decided that they would have Fuchs join Peierls in Birmingham to work on this top secret project. Now, you can see straight away, clearly Fuchs would have to be vetted at this point to check that he could take part in this, and I'll show you in a minute or two what happened there. But to get the history of events right, Fuchs was in Edinburgh, indeed. He was aware that he was being invited to join Peierls in a project of which he knew nothing. And I also found in the National Archives, because he was an enemy alien, any travelling that he did overnight had to have special permission. And the papers are there that show that he only once took an overnight from Edinburgh, which was, in fact, for about a week. He visited London. And we know from other sources that he visited a group of communist emigres in North London, in the Lawn Road Flats in Hampstead, if you want to go and visit it. And during this visit, he met a man, Colonel Kramer, who was actually the Soviet military attaché and had a physics background. And he talked with Kramer about nuclear fission. And as I say, don't panic. At this moment, nuclear fission, as I said, was in the literature. Nobody had any serious expectations that it would be a weapon, though the idea was clearly there in the background, as Oppenheimer had said. But Fuchs didn't know anything special at that time. But Kramer was impressed enough to say, keep in contact. So that's April 41. It's May 1941 when Fuchs joins Peierls in Birmingham and for the first time learns what exactly this project is that he's taking part in. It is to prepare uranium for an atomic bomb, and it is quickly clear, it's not an overstatement to say this would be a bomb that could redefine the nature of warfare. And if you realise that Britain had only just about come through the Battle of Britain and was almost on its knees at this stage, and Europe was being overrun as well, the possibility that the Nazis were going to win the war, unless something happened, was very clearly of great importance. So Fuchs finds himself in this situation where he's going to be working on a project that could determine the fate of the war and of history. A thing that I didn't know when I wrote the book, but I discovered afterwards, I mean, I know that Fuchs lived with the Peierls and his wife in their house in Birmingham. The Peierls at that stage had 2 young children, and because of the threat of bombing, the 2 children had just been sent off to stay with their friends in Canada. And so you can picture the case now emotionally that the Peierls suddenly found themselves with an empty nest, into which Klaus Fuchs comes and lives with them, almost metaphorically, like a son. And I hadn't appreciated until I learnt that from Peierls' daughter, how significant that probably was in the relationship, as we will see at the end. Now, as I said, Fuchs obviously was vetted before he could enter this, and I found the results of this in the National Archives. There's 25 volumes on Fuchs alone, and the first entry, number 1A, is a letter from Kiel in 1934, which has been sent to the chief constable of Bristol, where Fuchs was a student. Fuchs's passport had expired, and the Gestapo were wanting to try to get him back by saying the only way you can get your passport renewed is physically to come back to your place of birth, and Fuchs was not going to do that. And so they then started trying to lean on the authorities, and this letter here contains 2 key things. Fuchs joined then the Communist Party, and when his house was raided, books of the Communist Party were found. Now, there was no crime in being a member of the Communist Party, but, as you well appreciate, having any association with communism at that time, not least because Russia at that time was in a pact with Hitler of non-aggression. So effectively, Russia were our enemies at that stage, was information which should have stopped him being taken on board at all. But they ignored it because the source was the Gestapo, and therefore they didn't trust it. And that is the only direct evidence throughout the whole saga. Each and every time when Fuchs goes to New York, when he goes across to Los Alamos, when he comes back to Harwell, this piece of key evidence is disregarded because it came from the Gestapo. That is irony. Okay. So Fuchs is into the project, May 1941. The other question that there'd been a lot of confusion about was when did he actually start espionage? And that, I think, I've now pinned down. I can't prove this, but you'll see it is very strong circumstantial evidence. Put yourself in Fuchs's position. June 1941, the pact between Stalin and Hitler breaks down. And Winston Churchill goes on the old Home Service and makes this statement in which he says, "The Russians are now our friends. We will do everything we can to help them." You are Klaus Fuchs. You are a communist. You have just heard your new adopted Prime Minister say, "We will do everything we can to help them." And you are on a project which could change the nature of warfare. And incidentally, well, the Soviet Union is being frozen out of it because we didn't trust them. So you can see what sort of reaction you might have. You clearly make contact with Colonel Kramer again. Now, I know this because of this, from the 8th of August 1941, there is a coded message which was later decoded, in which it says, on the 8th of August, Bark, that is the Russians' code name for Colonel Kramer, had a meeting with a former acquaintance, Dr. Fuchs, former acquaintance because they had already met back in April at that meeting in the Lawn Road Flats. Blah, blah, blah. Various things were not decoded, but at the bottom, 1,000 tons of dynamite. The very phrase that was in the Fuchs-Peierls memorandum. So you see that by the 8th of August, Klaus Fuchs has told Colonel Kramer about the Frisch-Peierls memorandum. So Fuchs is already passing information by August. They don't take on spies overnight, you have to check them. So it would have been some time before that that he'd offered the services, and I would expect that Churchill's June of 1941 statement was probably the key that started it. I should also explain a little bit about this document, which is rather strange. You'll see it's got 1968 on there. The Russians sent many messages, obviously, during the war about many things, which, of course, were across the telegraph wires, and they were recorded, but they're all in code. And they used one-time pads, and such codes are completely and utterly unbreakable, as long as you don't use the one-time pad twice. It turns out that the Russians, for some reason, did use the one-time pad twice, and that gave a little entree to cryptographers that eventually enabled them to start decoding these things. But not until after the war did they have any success, which is a great shame, because this particular thing is the only time Fuchs's name is mentioned. All other decodings refer to him by code name. But here Fuchs was mentioned directly, but unfortunately this was not decoded until 1968. But so it's interesting historically in that sense. I'll tell you more about these sort of messages later on because they will turn to play a key. So Fuchs is now in the game, he's spying, working at Birmingham. And one of the questions that I had wondered, because for the next 2 years, he's at Birmingham living in the Peierls' house as a family member, as well as working on this project. And he manages to meet initially Colonel Kramer twice in 1941, and then he was transferred to Agent Sonia. If any of you have read Ben McIntyre's book about her, you will know all about her. The girl from Banbury, she was known. She lived variously in Chipping Norton and Kidlington and around here. And she would meet Fuchs in Banbury as a sort of midway point. Fuchs coming down from Birmingham and she coming up from the Chipping Norton area to see him. And I'd often wondered, how did he achieve this? Because it's one thing being a spy, but when you're living in the house at the Peierls', you've got to get away to do this. Well, we know a great deal now because the Russians, among many ironies of this story, there are things still classified in the UK which are public knowledge in the former Soviet Union. And from that, in particular, we know the dates. This, at the bottom, is an English translation of KGB files, which became available when the wall came down in 1989. And so these shipment dates at the bottom are the dates when information was received in Moscow. And so you see there's 2 in 1941, which was his link with Kramer, and there's 5 through 1943, which is with Agent Sonia. And I have highlighted one on the 12th of July 1943, which will be interesting for the reason which is about to be revealed. So that's when this information arrives in Moscow. So Completely unrelated to this, there I am in the Bodleian Library looking through Peierls' papers. And the great thing about Rudy Peierls was that he kept all his correspondence, not just the messages that he had typed, not just the messages that he had received, but also carbon copies of the messages that he had typed. So you can see the full story. And in this stuff are these quite innocent-looking letters in their own right. The first one, the 6th of July, is from Professor Hoon Rothery here in Oxford, who's written a book, and he's wanting the equations checked, and he thought that perhaps one of these emigres might have some way of earning some money to check the equations, and he writes to Peierls asking if Klaus Fuchs might check his book. And on the 8th of July, Peierls writes back to say that Fuchs is on holiday this week, so he'll find out when he comes back. So we know that Fuchs is on holiday on the 8th of July, and it was the 12th of July when information is received in Moscow. So clearly there, from these other letters in the Bodleian, we can work out Fuchs used a holiday as one means of being away from the Peierls' home to meet his contact. So by the end of 43, the project has become so large that the whole thing is now ready to move across to the States. What Fuchs and Peierls and about a dozen others had been working on was the theory of uranium diffusion, gaseous diffusion, and that is what would eventually lead to the enrichment plant at Oak Ridge in Tennessee. You can see the picture down the bottom. That is actually a vast enterprise. And so Fuchs and Peierls and the other Brits go across to New York, basically to complete a realistic design of the facility that will produce the uranium for an eventual bomb. And so now Fuchs, of course, is vetted for the second time, and again, the Gestapo thing is ignored. But I did find in the files this rather bizarre letter written by Major Garrett, who is in the security services, and it is sent to Michael Perrin, who was effectively the administrator in charge of the whole tube alloys project, in which it says, and it's about Klaus Fuchs. And it's clear, there are suspicions in the security services about Fuchs, and here is Garrett's opinion. It would not appear to be desirable to mention his proclivities to the authorities in the USA. In other words, keep quiet about it. And we do not think it at all likely that he will be able to make political contacts in that country while he's there. Well, how wrong can you be? But I found that quite remarkable, that even today there are papers that have been blacked out in these things from 70 years ago. If I had been filleting the files, I'd have got rid of that one. I mean, if you want the proof to General Groves that the Brits pulled over your eyes, it is right there. Anyway, so now Fuchs is there in New York, working with Peierls and the others on the uranium diffusion. By 1944, the bomb construction is taking place at Los Alamos, and Fuchs and Peierls move across to Los Alamos to join that. Uranium is a way to make a bomb, but the new way has been developed, which is to build a plutonium bomb, and they start working on that. Fuchs also starts work at the end of the war on the hydrogen bomb. He and Johnny von Neumann have a patent on a way to trigger a hydrogen bomb, which is quite remarkable. If you look at the politics of those two guys, they're almost as far apart as you could imagine. And all of this stuff was sent to Russia thanks to Klaus Fuchs. And as I mentioned in passing, his sister crystal was used as a link to connect with the Russians, but we can come back to that if necessary. Now, what I wanted to do is to show you his third phase of espionage, that this, to my mind, was the most dangerous. During the war, like it or not, the Russians were allies. And that is actually the reason why when Fuchs was eventually convicted, he was not executed. He was passing information to an ally. After the war, that certainly was not the case. The Cold War was beginning, and Fuchs at Harwell was passing information which was showing Stalin the full extent of Western powers' ability to confront him, if you like. But the first thing that I found that Fuchs did, which had not been known, was that he passed the original ideas on the hydrogen bomb to the Soviet Union as early as September 1945. And this is the evidence that I have for that, and I'll let you judge whether you would convict on this or not. So, the first thing before we get to Fuchs on this, the 16th of July is the date of the Trinity test, which, if you like, is a demonstration that an atomic explosion indeed will happen. And the 6th of August is, of course, when the uranium bomb was dropped over Hiroshima. I was astonished to discover that before Hiroshima had even happened, within 2 weeks of the Trinity test having shown an atomic bomb is practically possible, Enrico Fermi was already giving a lecture at Los Alamos on how you could use an atomic explosion as the spark to ignite a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb explosion, that blew my mind. There had been awareness that there had been a lecture by Fermi, and digging around in the National Archives here, there are some papers that show that some notes were made of this lecture and were transmitted to various important people, but it's all classified. Other than the titles, you can't find it. However, ironically, two things. One, the Russians in 1989 produced a book on the history of their atomic bomb, which has all of this information in it. It's in Russian, but the equations are readable. And the freedom of information in the States, thanks to the intervention of Alex Wellerstein, managed to get hold of this Fermi lecture. The first thing that blew our minds were there wasn't a lecture. There were 6 of them. You don't need to read all these, it's just to show that there were 6 lectures. Fermi was trying to work out in practice, the basic idea that he and Teller had as early as 1941 was that if an atomic explosion was possible, the critical mass concept, you have to have enough uranium or plutonium together to make it explode. If it's less than critical, it won't. So you see that an atomic explosion is limited, that the very act of exploding will create instantly pieces that are below the critical mass and the explosion will stop. So horrible though an atomic explosion is, it has an upper limit. A hydrogen bomb, however, has no limit other than a practical one. The sun is an example. The more you bring together, the more you could do. Whether you can speed up the sun, which has been burning for 5 billion years, to do it in a 5 billionth of a second is the challenge. And Fermi and Teller had realized that the temperature in an atomic explosion of millions of degrees could provide the heat to get that fusion started. Yes, you get it started, but keeping it going turned out to be the problem. It was about 7 years before that was solved. But here is Fermi giving the first lectures on this, and the first 5 lectures are down the left-hand column there, the 6th one at the bottom. His 5th lecture was given on the 17th of September. Now, we know from FBI records that on the 19th of September, Klaus Fuchs went to Santa Fe and met Harry Gold, who was his intermediate. He was the courier who picked up information from Fuchs and then passed it on to the Soviet embassy, who then had to send it to Moscow. So he met Harry Gold 2 days after Fermi's 5th lecture. Question number 1, you're Klaus Fuchs. Would you tell Harry Gold what you've just learned 2 days before? Of course you would. If you've got any doubt, let me show you. The lectures of Fermi, at the top, there is a diagram of a beryllium oxide tamper and a deuterium and tritium and so forth. That's from the Fermi lectures, thanks to freedom of information. The Russian document at the bottom has a diagram which looks remarkably like that. And this being a numerate audience, you will notice that that set of figures in Fermi's lectures has a remarkable similarity to the set of figures in the Russian document down the bottom. And the final thing, if you want to look at the Russian document, there it is. Anybody who can translate it, make a note of that and go and check it out. The interesting thing is, there is nothing in that document of Fermi's 6th lecture, which had not yet been given. So I think that is as near as you can get as a smoking gun or smoking bomb or whatever, that indeed on the 17th of September, on the 19th of September 45, Fuchs passed news of Fermi's lectures on the hydrogen bomb. Now, with hindsight, of course, it turned out that the hydrogen bomb the understanding of it at that stage, Fermi's conclusions were he couldn't see how to do it in practice. And indeed, it was a very difficult project to solve. But this, at the very least, showed the Russians that the West was seriously thinking about this, and it set them off thinking this is indeed a worthwhile thing to pursue. Post-war, Fuchs now comes back to Harwell. Well, Harwell was just being founded. The problem politically was that the McMahon Act in the States said that the Americans were going to keep all their nuclear know-how themselves and not share it with anybody, not even with their closest allies, who actually, to be fair, had seen how to do it. I mean, the Americans paid for it, but we saw how to do it. And so we decided we had to go it alone, and we were going to focus on developing nuclear power, and that is what Harwell was built to do the original experiments, working out in practice how to make a reactor that could liberate energy and so on. And Calder Hall was the first commercial reactor in the Western world, probably anywhere, directly as a result of that Harwell work. Of course, we being physicists know that not only does a nuclear reactor liberate energy, but some of the uranium turns into plutonium, and that you can use plutonium as a fissile material, and indeed that was another covert interest. And so Calder Hall, which by chance was only a few hundred meters away from Sellafield or Windscale, where they were building the plutonium for the British atomic bomb, was obviously just a pure coincidence. But all of this information was being passed by Fuchs to the Soviet Union at a time when the threat of World War III was certainly beginning. And that is why I regarded this as his most dangerous phase, and that's why I wanted to really spend this central part of the talk on this. So as I said, 1946, Britain had been cut out of all atomic research by the USA, and the Prime Minister decided, we had to go it alone and build our own atomic bomb. Now, this project was so secret that even members of the cabinet didn't know of it. And the person in charge of it was Bill Penny. Bill Penny had been at Los Alamos. His background was, he wasn't a nuclear physicist, he was more a hydrodynamics mathematician and so forth. But he was the director in charge of the British atomic bomb project, which took place at Fort Halstead near Tunbridge Wells. Klaus Fuchs probably knew more about the atomic bomb and the emerging ideas of the hydrogen bomb of anybody outside a few people in North America, because he had stayed on for a year at Los Alamos after the war, because the Brits, being aware that we were being frozen out, basically decided that Fuchs could stay there for a year and keep an eye on what was going on. Fuchs spying for us on the Americans for that next 12 months. And so he then comes back. So he is one of the world experts on how to build an atomic or hydrogen bomb. Now, he was the head of the theoretical physics group at Harwell, which was not directly involved in this work. It was all, as I said, taking place at Fort Halstead. But he was the go-to man. And Fuchs would visit Fort Halstead periodically and give seminars and discussions with them about how to build the British atomic bomb. All of this was an open book in Moscow, thanks to him. The fact that we were building an atomic bomb at all was an open book in Moscow due to this. Fuchs's colleagues, Cockcroft, of course, must have been aware as the boss at Harwell, but Fuchs's colleagues didn't know of this work that he was doing. And ironically, the thing that got me started on this whole Fuchs business was one of these coincidences that I've been researching Bruno Pontecorvo, as Steve mentioned, and I just thought, I wonder what there is on Fuchs, and I opened up the Fuchs file, and the first thing I actually saw was his travel expenses sheet. And it was a list of where he had gone and the dates he had gone, and he went to Cambridge about 3 times, and the distance, whatever it was, 150 miles round trip, something like that, except on one occasion, the round trip was 180 miles, and that was on the 13th of February. Now, it happens my wife's birthday is the 13th of February. That's the reason why I had noted that date, because I remembered on the 13th of February, my wife's birthday was one of the dates that Fuchs had met his Russian contact in London. And so that was the extra 20 miles. He had used the cover of going to Cambridge to take a detour and meets his contact in London. Another occasion, it turns out he went and gave a talk at Fort Holstead about the bomb 24 hours before meeting his contact in London. So he was using this secret work on the British atomic bomb as a cover and also to meet his contacts and pass information on, I was going to say red hot, if that's the right information. So this shows actually how I regard, as I said, his time during Harwell as the most significant of all, as it turns out. And this went on for another 4 years, totally undetected. Then, in August 1949, two things happened. First of all, the Russians exploded an atomic bomb, which shocked everybody. How had they done it so quickly? Well, of course, we know the answer now. But and Fuchs, I put down job done. Certainly, from this time on, Fuchs stopped espionage. The reasons why we can discuss probably in a few minutes when you know a bit more. But one possibility simply is that he had been doing this for 8 years. He had achieved the purpose, which had been to build an atomic bomb before the Germans got one, and then post-war to ensure that everybody had a share in it, if you like, mutually assured destruction being put into practice. And now he probably wanted out. The other thing that happened coincidentally, at almost the same time, was that these Russian codes started being cracked. And that's what I wanted to talk about for 5 minutes. This whole project of the decoding was called the Venona Project. The National Security Agency in the States have a website, and you can go to nsa.gov and look at there, and over about a period of 20 or 25 years, about 3,000 or more messages, not necessarily scientific bomb ones. I mean, a lot of it is industrial espionage, but about 3,000 messages were decoded. And they're all there to view in their final form. And one of these messages turns out to be very significant because it is the one that exposed the presence of a spy at Los Alamos, whose code name was Rest, and they quickly worked out it was either Peierls or Fuchs. And then, as we'll see in a moment, they decided it was Fuchs. And the credit for doing this cracking is always been given to the FBI, not least because there were relatively few books written on this until recently, because so much of it was still classified. But a man called Robert Lamfair wrote an autobiography which had a sort of like a bit of a Liz Truss view of the world, you know, that I did it all. And he credits the FBI, and not least himself, with doing this. But actually, I will show you that it was much more GCHQ, or in their, as they were known then, GC and CS, the Government Code and Cipher School, which became GCHQ post-war. So how do I know this? Well, let me just tell you how to find it out for yourself, because the mole that helped me on this didn't break any Official Secrets Act, but did it the Bernstein-Woodward way of showing me where to find the needles in the haystack. And so if you go to the nsa.gov site, so you will find thousands of messages, and you'll notice that there are two styles. Some messages have a black circle in the top right, and other ones don't. And by vast, the black circled ones are the dominant number. The black circled ones are basically what GCHQ did, and the other ones are what the NSA did. And what is interesting, as we will see in a moment, is that the key message that exposed Fuchs was decoded by the GCHQ people. So how did they do that, and what was the relationship? And this is something which is interesting, the history of how this all started. The special relationship that we hear so much about, which is probably non-existent, if it exists at all, goes back to 1942 and the fact that Britain was very good at cryptography. In 1942, there's this delightful letter that is buried in the Bodleian Library somewhere from Winston Churchill to President Roosevelt. One night when we talked late, you spoke of the importance of our cipher people getting into close contact with yours. So that is the beginning of the idea that we're going to collaborate together. The second red box, some time ago, our experts claimed to have discovered the system and so basically what Churchill is saying is, you have been encoding your diplomatic messages for a long time, well done. Our cipher people actually, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, have been reading them. Now that America is in the war with us, I've instructed this should stop. But our people and your people should get together to see how we can move this forward. And incidentally, Mr. President, top right there, he asks that, if possible, burn this letter when you have read it, which he obviously didn't do. So that is how it all began. And indeed, the work that was going on over in the States and here, it was completely homogeneous, the interchange of people all working together. And thanks to my guide through this myriad, I'll just show you an illustration and then the significance of it. So the stuff that was released in the 1960s and 70s were the final decrypts, and they stopped putting money to do anymore because there was no interest by then. But what I really wanted to know was what was known and when. And it happens that in an internal history of this whole project, wonderful, the particular letter that exposed Fuchs is there where it was in 1948 and where it was by 1949, and here it is. On the left is what the National Security Agency had got by that time. Basically nothing. The green box that I put there is just for reference when you look to the right-hand side in a moment. The yellow box around Enormos. Enormos was the Russians' code name for the Manhattan Project. So all the NSA had discovered by 1948 was they are sending messages not just about industrial espionage, but there's something here about the atomic bomb. But what it was, I mean, you can see in there, they don't know very much at all. A report, efferent fluctuation, then 1F, 2G. There's more that they can't decode than they can decode. 12 months later, or a year or so later, the British people have got working on this, and this is what the message has revealed. The bits in red are not yet decoded in the original version. But now we know that a report has been received from REST, so that's a code name, not that it's very helpful, but it's a code name. Diffusion method, work on his speciality. Expressed doubt the possibility of remaining in the country, that means, okay. And down at the bottom, REST assumes he will have to leave in a month to 6 weeks. So I'll move on and show you that with the date on it. So the original message was transmitted on the 15th of June 1944. It wasn't decoded for another 10 years. But so the original message has shown us that there's a spy called REST who works on diffusion, his speciality. You're quickly focusing in from that to the British delegation. And the key thing at the bottom is that REST assumes he will have to return in a month or so to the UK. So this is where things were at 1944 at this point. And it's another of these fortunate coincidences in time. Those of you who watched Oppenheimer know that Edward Teller had a habit of falling out with people. It got to the point where Oppenheimer had to boot him out of the project, basically. Teller wanted to work on the hydrogen bomb on his own. So Teller was removed from the project, and Beta, who was in charge of the theory division, said, well, we need a replacement for him, and my old friend Rudolf Peierls is the man. So Peierls was at that time in New York working on the project, and so Peierls was invited over to Los Alamos. He was there for 3 weeks, and the 3 weeks he was in Los Alamos, fortunately for him, were including the 15th of June, when somebody, REST, the spy, has made contact with his Soviet contacts out of New York. So Peierls is well out of it. Second thing is, 3 weeks later, Peierls comes back to New York, and one of the things that he's learnt at Los Alamos is that they're building a bomb of plutonium. The problem is it's very difficult to make plutonium implode. This is a huge mathematical problem which we don't know how to solve, but Peierls had noticed that the mathematical approaches were very similar in structure to the things that he and Fuchs had worked on way back in a different context in Birmingham. So for that reason, he recommended that Fuchs join him and others at Los Alamos to work on this project, which indeed happened. That is why Fuchs, who was preparing to go back to Britain to work on the beginnings of Harwell, didn't go back and went across to Los Alamos. So the bit at the bottom there, Rest believes he will have to leave in a month to 6 weeks, was because he thought he was going back to Britain, and suddenly, as a result of Peierls having been at Los Alamos, no, he's not, he's going to Los Alamos, which indeed he did. So that was finally decoded at that level in August 1949, and it wasn't until October that the research had been finally done on the whole British delegation, and they narrowed it down from this to confirm that the spy, Rest, is Emil Julius Klaus Fuchs. And this message is from the British Embassy in Washington, sent to the security services in the UK, sent out of Washington on the 4th of October. It's received in London on the 11th of October. Patterson, who signed it at the bottom, was the MI5 representative in Washington Embassy. And he says, I understand the local MI6 representative is sending the gist of this to his HQ. And for those of you who don't know, the MI6 representative was Kim Philby. At which point you start putting two and two together. So much so, just look at this date, 4th of October, the message is sent, 11th of October, it's received in London. Is this a coincidence? On the 9th, I put 9, or is it, well, on the 12th or 13th of October, Klaus Fuchs suddenly takes it upon himself to go and see Henry Arnold, the Harwell security officer, and tell him that his father has been offered a job in what we now call East Germany, and will that be a problem for him continuing to work at Harwell and so on? It's now clear that Fuchs was just testing the waters to see what was actually known over here about what was going on. One of the things that I have not been able to find is any chink in the record as to how, in the space of that 2 days, the message got to Fuchs that he had been rumbled back out there. I mean, it's just too much of a coincidence, this date similarity. And also, Stephen mentioned Pontecorvo. I wrote the Pontecorvo book before I met any of this, and any of you who've read that book, just go and check out when Pontecorvo, 6 months later after this, goes to the same Henry Arnold to tell him that his brother is a member of the Communist Party. The formulaic way that Pontecorvo did it is very similar to what was done here by Fuchs, and I'm sure that this was done for very obvious reasons. As a result of that meeting with Arnold, Fuchs decides they haven't got anything on him, he's in the clear, but MI5 want to catch him in the act because the decrypting program is so secret it could not be used in any court proceedings. They've got to catch him in the act. And so they start watching him 24/7. Unfortunately for them, Fuchs has stopped spying. But there are now, I think, about 8 volumes of the reports from the bugging of his phone in his apartment, the prefab at Harwell, and so on and so forth. And all they discover is that he's having an affair with Ernest Skinner, who is the wife of the head of nuclear physics, which again starts ringing alarm bells, as you might well imagine. But anyway, it showed that Fuchs had a life. It's quite amusing reading some of these things. There's one point which it says that Ernest Skinner and Fuchs were having a conversation, and then they moved to another room, and Fuchs couldn't be heard, but occasionally Mrs. Skinner made inaudible sounds. So anyway, reading their reports, I mean, they followed them intensely closely. I mean, they followed, on the 28th of September, for example, there's a report that they followed Fuchs and Ernest Skinner all the way to London to a meeting and back. They stopped for an hour at the Bull Inn in Henley, drinking double gins before driving to Harwell. Those were the days. Then on the 17th to 19th of January, Fuchs and Mrs. of the 17 Hillside Harwell spent the night at the Riviera Hotel in Maidenhead, and then the next 2 nights they stayed at the Palm Court in Richmond, which probably John you know well. And then for some reason during this stay, he confessed to her that things were not well. What the nature of this confession was, we don't know. But it clearly alerted her and worried her enough that people started raising noise. And on the 23rd of January, Henry Arnold had lunch with Fuchs at the Stevenson Old Railway House Hotel. And during the course of that lunch, he deduced that Fuchs was under great pressure. He felt that Fuchs had something that he wanted to reveal and get off his chest. And the following day, this was taken over by Scarden, the MI5 chief investigator, who took lunch with Fuchs at Abingdon's Grandest Hotel, which is not the Crown and Thistle. Back then it was the Queen's Hotel, which is now the Starbucks or something like that on the marketplace. There's no record of who was paying for all these lunches, but at the end of it all, they went back to Fuchs's prefab, and Fuchs made a confession, which is there in Scarden's handwriting, and Fuchs signed and agreed that that is indeed a statement. And as a result of this, he's arrested, he's sent to jail for 14 years. But the fallout from this is immense, as you can imagine, because it's from this that eventually leads to the decimation of the networks in North America, culminating with the Rosenbergs being executed. And as you can imagine, the KGB is not pleased. As far as they're concerned, Fuchs is a total failure. So as you went at the start, I said, successful spies are the ones you don't know about. There's truth in that. So Fuchs was in jail for 14 years. On good behavior, he was released after 9 and returned to East Germany for the first time in 30-odd years, 30-plus years. Free at last, I say, except that the KGB had plans. They wanted him to be their agent in East Germany, which actually he didn't. Or if he did it very successfully, but apparently he didn't. But they really wanted to know the reasons for his failure, and I won't go into that here. That's a story for you to read in there if you want to. So the ends of his life, 59 to 88, he was the deputy director of the nuclear physics lab in Dresden. He kept up communications with Nick Curti here, the Oxford physicist who many of you will probably know. And he also kept up communication with Henry Arnold, the Harwell security officer who had been involved in his exposure. The great tragedy that I found in the Peierls correspondence, though, was this. When Peierls learnt that Fuchs was about to be released, he made contact with him and said, "Dear Klaus, I see from the papers that you are soon going to be released. If you need any help in getting started in life, financial or otherwise, or if you need advice, please let me know. I shall do what I can." And Fuchs never replied. There was no communication between Fuchs and the Peierls family for the rest of their lives. And I find that very profound. As I said, he communicated with these other scientists who he had and Henry Arnold, if you like, who he had only had professional relationships with. But he had lived with the Peierls family, and there's a very profound letter that Genia Peierls wrote to Fuchs after his arrest, which I quote in the book, which I'm sure broke him. And I don't think he could face them. It was simply that. He probably couldn't face himself. That the thing that broke Fuchs was the shame of betraying his friends. Anyway, that is how it ended up. So to end, these are the faces of Klaus Fuchs as we know him: the student in 1933, the spy in 1944. Somebody took a photograph of him on the plane flying back to East Germany in 1959, and then in the later years of his life, there he is in 1979. That's the Klaus Fuchs we know, because he confessed and we know what he did. But suppose he hadn't confessed. We would not know any of this. We would know Klaus Fuchs as the man who was the key figure behind the British atomic bomb and the British hydrogen bomb, in addition to all the other stuff that he had done. He would have been the atomic hero of 1944. He would have become an FRS. Indeed, he was nominated for FRS, and there is a coy letter saying that perhaps in the circumstances that he would not be appropriate to represent the society, though there are by 1979 he would have been a retired Englishman. And look what happens to the people that we know and worked with. I mean, Rudy Peierls was knighted. Bill Penny, who lived for some time down the road here, not far away in East Hendred. Instead, there's a blue plaque for him. There should be a blue plaque where Klaus Fuchs was arrested in Abingdon, but anyway. Bill Penny became Baron Penny of East Hendred. Fuchs's successor at Harwell was Brian Flowers. An ironic aside before I forget it, it took 2 years before they put a successor in place because they had to make damn sure that the person was squeaky clean after all that happened before. So Brian Flowers was indeed appointed, and there's an article in the Daily Express from those times. It says that he definitely is the right sort of person because his father is a parson. It didn't mention that Klaus Fuchs's father had been a parson, but anyway, there you are. And he ends up becoming Lord Flowers of Queensgate. So I am sure that we'd have had Lord Fuchs of Harwell, the Red Baron. So, well, as you say, you can read all about it in there. And one thing I'll just say, what I spent the last 6 months of last year for various technical and personal reasons that some of you know about, was researching the story of Oppenheimer, because I was ill and unable to go, so I spent the time writing a prequel and a sequel to Oppenheimer, inspired by my 10-year-old grandson, who said, "Grandpa, do you know all about Tsar Bomba?" And I thought, what's Tsar Bomba? And it turns out he then told me, oh, it was the 50-megaton bomb that the Russians built. It's the biggest ever done. I thought, I don't know about this. So I went and learned all about it, and I became fascinated. It just took 70 years from Becquerel accidentally discovering a smudge on a photographic plate, and from that being able to develop atomic energy to the point you could destroy the whole of the planet. Meanwhile, I was actually benefiting from the positive things of radiations and so forth. So there you are. It's the 80th anniversary of the atomic age, and this will come out next July. And if we're still here, we might chat about it. But I can now hopefully answer the questions that you really wanted me to talk about. Thank you.